In this video, I'm going to be talking about the cure to cancer, the cure to Alzheimer's, how to grow taller when you're growing in your growing stages anyways, how to lose weight, and our problems with arthritis and many other problems probably that you might have or you're interested in getting rid of. I'm going to be talking about how to cure or how to solve those problems. So to understand the cure to cancer, the cure to Alzheimer's, weight loss, how height works, our problems with arthritis, and many other problems, they're actually related to endocrinology. And we're going to have to talk about endocrinology first, specifically the endocrinology of weight loss. And that brings us to our first topic. Calories are a myth. Yes, that's right. Everything you've heard or everything you've learned about calories is actually false. Well, not everything exactly, but it's not true. And there's a better science that helps us understand why people actually lose and gain weight. And it isn't based on calories. In fact, calories are very outdated. It has to do with the insulin to glucagon ratio and hormone-sensitive lipase. But first, let's start with the basics. So first, we need to talk about what insulin does, or specifically what happens when you eat carbohydrate. Well, when you eat carbohydrate, your body, your pancreas specifically, will produce insulin. And when you eat fat, for instance, a steak, your body will produce glucagon. Understanding insulin and glucagon at the simplest level is very important because this is what determines whether or not your body chooses to either store weight, which means gain fat, or to lose weight or lose fat. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about ketosis also. You might have heard the ketogenic diet as something that works, but I'm going to be explaining to you in this video why it doesn't really work that well. And yes, it will work a little bit, but there are much more effective methods to lose weight or to gain weight. Now, when insulin is dominant in your body, and the insulin basically is dominant over the glucagon, your body will choose to store weight or to gain weight. But when glucagon is dominant, on the other hand, your body will choose to lose weight or to get rid of fat, and it will use the fat as energy. But we already know that eating steak, for instance, would be eating fat and would produce glucagon. But we also know that eating sweet potato, for instance, carbohydrate, or maybe rice, would produce insulin. But what happens when we mix both together and we decide to eat meat with rice or meat with the sweet potato? Well, what happens when you mix both meat and carbohydrate, your body cannot produce insulin and glucagon at the same time, and it has to choose one or the other. Now, in this case, your body will always choose insulin. So if you eat rice and you eat meat with it, your body, even though there is fat and even though there may be some glucagon produced, there will actually be an increase in the amount of insulin. And this actually has to do with the fact that meat contains protein. Protein, in this case, acts as a catalyst. So what will happen is, let's say you were to eat, just somehow you will get pure protein with rice. Well, what will happen is your insulin to glucagon ratio, as we talked about before, insulin specifically, will start spiking like crazy. And what happens when that spikes? Your body immediately goes into the mode of, I need to store energy. So it will start storing energy, and it will start using glucose as a fuel. Now, let's say you were to just eat protein and fat. In this case, that would be in the form of meat. Well, your body will start producing glucagon, and in response, because glucagon does this, you will start losing weight instead of gaining weight because your glucagon levels will be elevated. Now, this is where some other factors come into play, specifically hormone-sensitive lipase. So when glucagon starts to dominate, hormone-sensitive lipase will be produced by your body. Now, what does hormone-sensitive lipase do? Hormone-sensitive lipase causes lipolysis, or basically the breaking of fat, and it will break fat. Specifically, it tries to go for white adipose tissue if there's any reserved or any available. White adipose tissue is around the belly. So since we know that our insulin to glucagon ratio, or specifically whether or not insulin dominates or whether or not glucagon dominates, determines whether or not we do or we do not lose weight, how do we make glucagon more dominant? Well, the simple way is we would have to cause our body to stop producing insulin or stop having so much insulin in our system. The way we do that is we usually fast for about 18 to 24 hours is the length of time. And after that length of fast, or after that period of time where we are not eating or abstaining from eating, we would eat meat. And what will happen is, because we already have our insulin to glucagon ratio as more glucagon dominant just by a little bit, eating meat with the protein, the fat and the protein specifically, protein acting as a catalyst, will cause the glucagon ratio to significantly increase. And increasing the glucagon ratio indirectly produces more hormone-sensitive lipase. And what does that hormone-sensitive lipase do? It breaks down the fat, specifically subcutaneous white adipose tissue. Now, this brings us to our next topic, how to cure cancer. Well, the cure to cancer is actually very simple. In fact, we already kind of knew about this a very, very long time ago, but we never really applied it to real life. And what do I mean by this? Well, first we have to go back to the 1930s, the Warrenberg effect. Now, the Warrenberg effect, Mr. Warrenberg figured out that cancer cells require exorbitant amounts of glucose to survive. But there was something else that came that was even more interesting. And further research showed that not only did cancer cells require exorbitant amounts of glucose, they also couldn't survive on ketone bodies. So what does that mean? Because we know these two pieces of information of how cancer cells specifically require extreme, exorbitant amounts of glucose and that they cannot function with ketone bodies or ketones, then how do we make our body start using ketones? Well, we already have the answer, and we already know how to starve cancer out and to get rid of it. Ketosis is simply just using your body's fat as energy instead of using glucose as energy. Specifically, it's using ketones as energy rather than glucose. One of the benefits of ketosis is it causes the increase in mitochondrial function as well as the amount of mitochondrial function. That means the efficiency and the amount of mitochondria are increased while in ketosis. Now, this is important because mitochondria, as we probably already heard, are the powerhouse of the cell. That was repeated in high school millions of times. And yes, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, and they create energy, ATP, but there's something that's a little bit more important with these ketones that will lead us to the cure to cancer as well as the cure to Alzheimer's. But if we already knew this, then all that means is cancer is just an unhealthy metabolic state, or at least 90% of cancer, 99% of cancers. There are some rare exceptions. For instance, some viruses can cause cancers, but even those viruses that do cause cancers, cancer can still be starved because the cancerous cells require exorbitant amounts of glucose. So how do we make ketosis happen more efficiently? How do we cause more ketosis to happen? Because we want our body to use more of our fat, and we want it to start getting rid of the cancer because we want to starve the cancer more and more. Or maybe there's another reason you want to do it. There are plenty of reasons. Alzheimer's is one of them, but let's just keep it with cancer, for instance. Let's say we want more ketosis. How do we get more ketosis happening? Well, that is from carnitine. Now, where exactly do we find carnitine then? How do we get this carnitine? It's really simple. It's actually found in animal meat. There is very, very low amounts of carnitine in plant, and therefore we cannot use this carnitine for ketosis. Now, some people also don't produce enough carnitine in the first place, which is like I think half the population. There's a lot of factors. So how do we get this carnitine? Simply through eating meat. So we already know how to get these ketones, but there's something else that's really important about these ketones, and it's that they are preferred by the brain almost all the time. The brain, if given the choice between glucose or ketones, will always choose ketones. Now, this is important because this is where Alzheimer's comes in. Specifically, we're going to talk about glycation and the effect of glucose on the brain. Now, this is really important because glucose actually affects the brain in a negative way. Specifically, there's something called glycation. Now, glycation is when a glucose molecule binds to a lipid or to a protein, and it sticks to it and it makes it unusable or completely unavailable. Now, this is a problem. And this is exactly what happens in Alzheimer's. When we are eating a lot of sugar, or maybe we're eating a lot of carbohydrate, what happens is these glucose molecules start sticking to these lipids and proteins in our brain, and they cause these ages and rages, or that's what they're called anyways. And because of that, the way to undo or reverse a lot of this damage is by making our brain use the fuel that it prefers to use, ketones. And we already know how we get ketones. We get it from putting ourselves in a fasted state first and then eating meat, because we want our glucagon to be dominant. We do not want insulin to be dominant. The next topic is going to be really important specifically for kids, and it's really, really simple. Now, we already talked about ketosis and a little bit of what it does, but there's something else that ketosis causes. It is really, really important in HGH. Now, HGH, or human growth hormone, is important for a lot of processes, especially while growing. For instance, the organ size, the tissue, the bone density, the bone length, like height basically, is all incredibly dominant or dependent on HGH. So, if you're a kid and you're still growing and you want to if you want to be taller, how do you do it? Through ketosis. Next, we're going to be talking about a little bit of a problem that probably a lot of people encounter, is daytime sleepiness, or narcolepsy. Now, what exactly is causing this narcolepsy? Now, there could be a lot of potential reasons, but I'm pretty sure there's one that is common between all individuals, and that has to do with orexin and insulin. Now, orexin is the hormone that regulates whether or not you are alert. Now, there is one thing that inhibits orexin, and specifically, basically, your alertness. What is that? Once again, insulin. Insulin can inhibit orexin, and that means that you'll feel sleepy during that time. So if you have an increase in insulin during a period, maybe you eat a lot of sweet potato or you eat a lot of carbohydrate of some sort, that's why you would feel that daytime sleepiness, because the insulin is inhibiting orexin. Next, this is going to be a little bit of a small part, but it's specifically related to depression. So there's polyunsaturated fats have been known to be linked to increases in depression. Now, what exactly are polyunsaturated fats? A good example might be vegetable oil, canola oil, grapeseed oil, or it's called something that I probably shouldn't say, but yeah. Sunflower oil, safflower oil. There's basically any sort of vegetable oil has higher amounts of polyunsaturated fat. Let's say we were to have a candy bar, and this candy bar had maybe some sunflower oil in it. Well, the fact that it's made with this sunflower oil means it contains high amounts of linoleic acid. Now, you might have heard linoleic acid is really good for you, and yes, but your body doesn't necessarily take this linoleic acid and keep it as linoleic acid. When you consume linoleic acid, it'll actually turn into something called arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid causes inflammation, has been known to cause inflammation, especially for your brain. Now, this arachidonic acid causes inflammation, and it also ends up in the brain. So you might guess, oh, well, maybe that's part of the depression. Even though linoleic acid is useful, the amounts in vegetable oil are exceedingly high, way, way too high. Next, we're going to be talking a little bit about heart attacks and LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and that whole thing, arterial plaque, basically. So once again, there is false science, and this time it isn't just calories, it's actually really, really false science. Such big false science that it caused huge problems for many, many Americans, especially. And this is the Ansel-Keys lipid heart hypothesis. This is also taught to doctors and taught to be correct. This is absurd how this is still taught, but regardless, we're going to talk about it. So Ansel-Keys came up with the hypothesis basically that LDL cholesterol is bad for you, and he showed it based on the fact that he took 13 countries. I think the number was 13, can't remember. And lo and behold, a little bit later, we realized he forged his data. But the news spread, and it spread like wildfire because it was promoted by sugar companies. And while spreading like wildfire, yes, Ansel-Keys was promoted by Big Sugar because cholesterol, specifically LDL, isn't actually bad for you. We already know the real contributor to arterial plaque. That has to do with the triglyceride to cholesterol ratio. Now, this means that if your triglycerides are really, really high and your cholesterol is really, really low, then you're definitely going to get arterial plaque. But if your cholesterol is really, really high and your triglycerides are really, really low, then you won't get arterial plaque. Now, this next topic specifically is going to be related to depression, kind of. It's actually going to be anxiety. Now, what exactly is anxiety? Anxiety is related to cortisol. Now, how exactly do we increase our levels of cortisol, meaning increase our levels of anxiety? A good way to increase our amount of cortisol would be to drink high amounts of caffeine, because caffeine stimulates the production of cortisol. Indirectly, that leads to more anxiousness. But there is another thing that releases cortisol, and it's subcutaneous fat, specifically white adipose tissue. Yes, white adipose tissue meaning belly fat. So belly fat actually increases levels of cortisol. That's a little crazy. Well, your fat cells actually secrete hormones, and in this case, they secrete cortisol, and that cortisol gets secreted. And because of that, if you have an increased amount of fat, you would have increased amounts of cortisol secretion. Indirectly, that means more anxiousness. Next, we're going to be talking about essential amino acids. And essential amino acids are important because they are determined whether or not your body actually takes and uses the food that you give it and makes something useful out of it, or just turns it into glucose. Now, there's 9 essential amino acids, and one of the problems with our body is that whatever the weakest link is for that specific amino acid is all that the body will be able to use. So if we only have a very small amount, let's say of histidine, and we have high amounts of every other amino acid, then whatever our smallest amount, specifically the histidine in this case, is going to be our limiting factor, and the rest of those amino acids get turned into glucose. Now, how do we get high amounts of essential amino acids, and how do we get them all so that the weakest link is covered for and they're all around the same amount? Well, the best that we can do, it comes to eating meat. Yes, that's because meat has all the essential amino acids, and compared to vegetables have a high amount of 1 or 2, maybe a couple essential amino acids, while meat usually covers for a broad range and a large amount. Now, for anybody who's interested in building muscle requires essential amino acids. Another thing that meat has, specifically over plants and vegetables, is that meat actually has more bioavailable nutrients in almost every category except vitamin C. But the nice thing is, if you are on ketosis, you won't need much vitamin C, because vitamin C is really important for oxidation. Anyways, besides that whole point, now what exactly do I mean by bioavailable and bioavailable nutrients? Well, to keep it simple, only on one specific vitamin, I'll be talking about K2 versus K1. K2 comes from animal sources, and K1 comes from plant sources. Now, our bodies can't convert this K1 that well and can't use it that well. So let's say we only eat 100 grams of it. Well, 5% of that gets converted. So it's an incredibly low efficiency. And compared to the meat that we eat, K2, which is much higher in terms of bioavailability, that means much more gets converted, and we actually absorb more of the K2. So the next topic is going to be arthritis, fibromyalgia, glass shards and deficiencies, and basically phytotoxins. So phytotoxins are basically plant defense chemicals, and phytotoxins you can actually taste usually. So a really good example would be glucosinolates. Glucosinolates taste bitter, and they're a phytotoxin, and they're basically the plant telling whatever is eating it, like, hey, stop. Now, phytotoxins have a lot of different effects in the diet, but I'm going to specifically be talking about nutrient hindrance, or basically hindering nutrient absorption, and as well as oxalates, and oxalates cause a lot of different problems, but that's what we're going to be talking about. So phytotoxins block nutrient absorption. There's a couple examples. So for instance, phytic acid, tannins, and oxalates, they're all good examples of things that will bind to nutrients and basically use the nutrient, so you can't use the nutrient or you can't absorb the nutrient. Now, there's a long list besides the 3 that I mentioned. I mean, it goes on and on. But there is proof of phytotoxin damage and oxalates being found in our organs. So specifically, some phytotoxin damage might be hemolytic anemia in cows. Now, if you feed cows, for instance, kale or spinach, and offer their regular, basically grass diet of what they eat for a little bit too long, which is what farmers recommend you do not do because you don't want to kill the cows, then the cows will end up dying of hemolytic anemia, and that's basically where your red blood cells end up dying faster than they can be created, so you're suffocating on the inside. It's nasty, absolutely terrible. And that phytotoxic damage that you would find in cows eating spinach and kale come from oxalates. Now, there's many other phytotoxins, obviously, as I've shown before, but specifically, we're just going to be talking about oxalates in this one. There, you can find other videos usually on all these other different phytotoxins. There isn't really too much detail specifically about them. We do know generally what they do, but we don't know the exact specifics of how bad it can get because it's a little bit difficult to measure, especially when the entire population is eating this regularly versus not eating this. But we do have an example of the Hazda tribe, which is a full carnivore tribe, but that's a completely separate thing. Anyways, oxalates can cause damage in a lot of places, and it can be found in the muscle, bone, skin, eyes, brain, and stomach. I mean, it can be found in a lot of places, and where it can be found, it's causing damage. And that's because usually oxalates, or oxalic acid in this case, is either 1, an inflammatory response, or 2, it can form oxalate crystals. And oxalate crystals will usually bind with a mineral, so for instance, calcium. That's the one that oxalates really seem to like to bind to a lot. It will form calcium oxalate crystals, and those crystals will basically end up being these little small glass shards, and they cause serious havoc. And as you can guess, those crystals can actually be found in bones and in organs, which is really bad. Oxalates can also damage the immune system. Specifically, they'll damage your macrophages from functioning. Now, macrophages are part of the innate immune system, so they're your first responders, and indirectly, oxalates will actually damage your macrophages and prevent them from functioning as well. So that's another really bad problem of oxalates. And the real problem is that the macrophages can't actually recognize the oxalate as basically being bad or being something that it needs to remove from the body at that moment. So only once you stop consuming oxalates, usually your body will recognize and be able to remove it from the body. But that is usually an uncomfortable process of oxalate dumping. That's a whole separate video. So as I talked about before, calcium oxalate stones, or specifically oxalates prefer calcium, they also can bind to other minerals. So for instance, they can bind to zinc, they can bind to magnesium, they can bind to potassium. There's a lot of minerals that oxalate can bind to, and because of that, it becomes a little bit problematic when your body starts removing this oxalate, because you start losing these minerals as it binds to these minerals in your body and gets flushed out of your system. So as I talked about before, that calcium is what oxalates prefer the most. We're going to be specifically talking about exactly how much oxalate. So we don't exactly have all the details on exactly how much oxalate is required in order to prevent nutrient absorption by what percent, but we do have a little bit of detail. Now, there does need to be more research, especially on all the minerals and all these other phytotoxins, but what we do know right now is that 70 milligrams of oxalate will prevent 1% of calcium absorption. So using this chart for oxalates and the oxalate content of many different vegetables, if we were to eat 100 grams of chives, for instance, in one day, then that would equate to about 1,400 milligrams of oxalate. And that roughly equates indirectly to maybe 20% calcium absorption hindrance. So 20% of the calcium that you're trying to get is not actually able to be digested because the oxalate is binding to the calcium, which is basically 20% less absorption of calcium. Now, there isn't too much research on oxalate damage also in general, and there needs to be more research done on oxalate damage in general, but we do know that oxalate damage does appear in many places. In addition to anti-nutrients, fiber also is an anti-nutrient indirectly. And fiber is basically just cellulose. Now, fiber might be seen as a necessary nutrient, but it actually isn't. In fact, it's actually really damaging for your gut, especially if you have gastrointestinal problems. So, for instance, ulcerative colitis, IBS, Crohn's. I mean, it's really, really bad. There are a couple other YouTubers on there who can attest to this, and they changed their diet lifestyle specifically to get rid of fiber completely because fiber has destroyed them. I mean, it made them have to have an organ removed because of it. It's nasty. It's really sad. So fiber is damaging, and even though it's talked a lot about saying fiber is good, fiber is not so good. To end this off, I just want to say that everything in this video that I'm talking about doesn't explain all of the science behind why all of carnivore works. There's much detail. There's too much detail that I left out, but I do want to try to explain as much of the science as I possibly can and give a better understanding of why exactly carnivore does work so well. And it's mostly because, one, fiber is really, really damaging. Phytotoxins are also really damaging. It's really, really important to have the right levels of correct amino acids and in balance, more specifically, because all amino acids are based on the weakest link. The effect of carnitine, the effect of ketosis on your body. The list is endless, honestly. It's way, way too important. And I hope everything that I said in this video makes sense. I have all my references also. As you could see, I put all the references in the video itself. So it's easier to follow along and see what exactly does the science really show that. Like, there's an actual scientific paper for everything. And that'll be it. So thank you for watching. If you're interested in another video like this and more of the detail and the science behind carnivore specifically, or just the science behind any of this nutrition sort of stuff and why it works the way it does or anything like that, throw it in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.